Today we know Crimea mainly from the news in the course of the war in Ukraine. It has always been a fiercely contested peninsula in previous history, mainly due to its strategic location. However, alongside the Russians and Ukrainians, the Germans also played an important role on the peninsula. The so-called Crimean Germans were one of the largest minorities in the local population, and at one time almost 60,000 German immigrants lived there. Today we are looking at the forgotten history of these so-called Crimean Germans. How did it come about that so many Germans settled on the peninsula? Why did they suddenly disappear, and how are the last remaining ones doing today? We look at all these questions in today's video. Have fun! To understand the exciting history of the Crimean Germans, we first have to travel back to the Middle Ages. From around the middle of the 13th century, Crimea was conquered by Mongolian Turkic peoples, also known as Tatars, who would shape the identity of Crimea for centuries to come. From them emerged the Crimean Khanate, whose common identity was based on Sunni Islam and which fell under the suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire from 1475. What followed was a centuries-long struggle between the Orthodox Christians in Russia and the Sunni Muslims in Crimea. In the meantime, the Crimean Tatars were so strong that they almost completely burned down Moscow in 1571. This burned itself into the Russian identity, and the battle for Crimea was now also waged more and more brutally by the Russians. Over the next few centuries, the Russians initially built huge fortification systems to protect themselves against the constant raids by the Crimean Tatars, and from the 17th century they also launched counterattacks. This was the beginning of the Crimean Wars, in which the Russians tried several times to conquer the Crimea and wipe out the Tatars. However, they only achieved a real breakthrough with the support of Austria. In the so-called Russo-Austrian-Turkish War, the German-born Field Marshal Burkhard Christoph von Münnich, in the service of the Russian Empress Anna, devastated Crimea for the first time in 1736. And this is where the history of the Germans in Crimea begins. From 1774, the Ottoman Empire also recognized the independence of Crimea, which from then on meant that it was incorporated into the Russian Empire. The surviving Tatars fled to the Ottoman Empire, and under Catherine the Great a targeted settlement of citizens of all nations friendly to the Russian Empire began. And after support in the Turkish wars, these were mainly German-speaking nations. From this time onwards, Germans from the region of southern Germany and the Swiss settled in Crimea. Of course, many Russians and Ukrainians also came, as well as other allied ethnic groups such as Greeks, Armenians, and Bulgarians. However, the Germans were always one of the largest minorities in Crimea. By the outbreak of the First World War, 314 German colonies had been founded on the peninsula, in which around 40,000 immigrants lived. Larger towns such as Friedenthal, Heilbronn, and Zurichtal were established. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the number of German immigrants had risen again to almost 60,000. The entire Crimea had a population of around 1.1 million at the time, making the Crimean Germans a significant ethnic group. But times changed with the Second World War. After the outbreak of the war, great hatred arose against the German settlers, who until then had enjoyed a very good reputation among the other ethnic groups. They feared collaboration with the Nazis if Crimea was conquered. The Soviet leadership therefore wanted to expel the Germans from Crimea for all time, and almost all Crimean Germans were deported to Kazakhstan as early as August 1941. Many of the Crimean Germans died from the exertions of the days-long journey to Kazakhstan. When the German Wehrmacht conquered Crimea a short time later, only 960 Germans were still living on the peninsula. The new occupiers carried out a cruel persecution and murder of the Jewish Crimean population, and it was not until 1944 that it was recaptured by the Soviet Union. However, the remaining Crimean Germans and other ethnic groups were now targeted, as they were accused of collaborating with the Nazis. Between May and June 1944, Stalin had the remaining Tatars, Greeks, Bulgarians, Armenians, and almost all German-speaking families deported. In total, almost 200,000 people were expelled from Crimea. It was only in the 1980s, in the wake of the Russian ideology of perestroika, that the expellees were able to return, but by then most of them had of course started a new life, and only a few took up the offer. It is estimated that of the 2.5 million inhabitants living in Crimea today, only 3,000 are of German descent, of whom only 250 speak German as their mother tongue. Following the Russian annexation of Crimea, President Vladimir Putin signed a decree in April 2014 according to which the deported Germans, Tatars, Armenians, Bulgarians, and Greeks were to be compensated. But in fact, the Association of Displaced Persons reported new harassment in Crimea. The majority of foreigners, including Crimean Germans, were expropriated and had to sell their properties to Russians. And since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Crimea has increasingly become a battlefield, which means that the remaining Germans are also increasingly leaving the area. If you like this video, subscribe to this channel now so you don't miss any more in the future. If you want to support us further, you can become a channel member. Thanks for watching.